Okay, good morning, everyone. Our topic for this week's shir is Habayis. May one visit the Temple Mount today? Thought it was apropos. This past week, Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. And also, as we'll see, this past week's Parshas Tazir Mitzorah, we talk about those who are excluded from the Machana Yisrael. We'll see different Machanos, different encampments. So it's relevant to the Parsha as well as the time period that we're in. I want to thank our sponsor for today's shir and breakfast. Josh Goldschmidt has sponsored in honor of his mother's yortzeit. What's her name? Tanya Bat Menachem Mendel. May her neshama have an aliyah. How many years is that?
I think it's been 10 years.
10 years. The 10th year yortzeit. Thank you. Wow. Okay. So it should be a zchus, and I think Josh is planning on also giving a shir at some point. So stay tuned for that. And I'm very honored to dedicate this shir in her memory. So I want to first of all thank Rabbi Reuven Brand. I listened to a shir that he gave. He has some great materials, and through him I found other things, and through those things I found other things. So there's some research materials. If you're really interested in this topic, I put down on your source sheet. You can take a look for further reading. And there's a few articles in Chakira, numbers of years apart, and Rabbi Brand, and a lot of good stuff on this topic. And it's a really vast topic, but we'll try to get to some bottom lines and some understanding of the current demographics and the current discussions. In 1866, the legendary British financier, banker, activist, philanthropist. No, not Zvi Wolf. You're not that old. But Sir Moses Montefiore. And in Hebrew, I noticed people write it as Montefiore, but I believe you pronounce it Montefiore. He made a trip to Eretz Yisrael. It was actually one of the many trips that he made to Eretz Yisrael. And he was very inspired and eventually became very active in the Jewish cause, and was really a leader of, Mesiras Nefesh, and he had access to many politicians and leaders, and he would advocate to the Pope and to the Tsar on the behalf of the Jewish people. And on one of his trips to Eretz Yisrael, Moses Montefiore is reported as visiting the Temple Mount, which caused a tremendous amount of controversy. Parenthetically, one of the times I saw this story recently, so I wanted to share you. One of the times Moses Montefiore was on his way to meet the Tsar to intercede on about a certain decree against the Jews. So he was traveling in a coach with horses and his whole entourage, and he was surrounded by a number of small children, Russian peasant children, and they started throwing rocks at his carriage, and they were screaming. Maybe Gabi will help us out with this. I don't know, but I don't.
Jew.
No, it was Jew, but it was Zid, which I think is a derogatory term for Jew. So he told his coachman to stop, and he said, "Bring the children to me," and they brought the children, and he said to them, "Little children, in England," which is where he lived, "I am referred to by my honorary title of Sir. And around the world, the most powerful of men stand up for me, and they address me as Lord Mayor. But he said to them, but know this, no honorific that I have ever received is as meaningful a praise as the one you have given me by calling me a Jew." And then he smiled, and he gave them some coins, and he said, "Thank you for reminding me who I am." So, just like an incredible person, and he was telling them, this is, at the end of the day, this is what I'm most proud about, and sort of flipping it on its head. So one of these trips, he went to the Temple Mount, and I found this is in a tshuva of Rav Ovadia, which we're going to read a number of different parts of it. Rav Ovadia Yosef, who was a major Jewish posek, leader, rabbi. He lived in Cairo and then later in Eretz Yisrael, and he was asked the question after the 1967 war. he writes about this, that he was sort of revisiting the question of going up to the Temple Mount when there was more access to it. So in this tshuva, he quotes that he found a story about Moses Montefiore, and he says that he went up to the Temple Mount, Imrabo, Dr. Levi. Any relation? I don't know. Rabbi Dr. Levi. And they went to the Makam HaMikdash, and it became very well known that he did such a thing, because he was a very prominent person, and, word got around. And the rabbis of Yerushalayim were very upset. Primarily, they were, upset that he went on the Temple Mount, and Rav Yaakov Leiberbum's son, Rav Yaakov Lisa, his son, who was living in Yerushalayim, his name was Rav Yosef Moshe Milisa, and he says here that he took a shofar and he proclaimed a cherem against Moses Montefiore. And because Moses Montefiore was very God-fearing, he went to the rabbis and he brought his rabbi with him, and he said, I was just going with my rabbi, and my rabbi said it was okay to go because of the heter of the Ravid, which we'll soon see. And the Rabbani Yerushalayim told him it's okay, don't worry. Ki charmu shel Rav Yosef Moshehu ke charmo shel Yam. It is like the cherem of Yam, which means don't worry about it. Rosh Tevos Yosef Moshe. That Yosef Moshe, don't worry about this person's cherem. Don't worry about it, it's okay. So Rav Ovadia, commenting on this story, says, for sure, he says, this doesn't show you that he was doing the right thing. They were telling him, you made a mistake. You went against the Rambam, the Rosh, and most of the poskim. You were following the Ravid, but you didn't know better. You were b'shogeg, and therefore, Eino chayev nidoy al kach, you shouldn't be obligated to be in cherem because you did it unaware and you didn't know, and therefore, we're not going to put you in cherem. Don't worry about this cherem. And that's the end of the story as cited in Rav Ovadia. I saw in an article, this fellow Lowenberg in the Chakira Journal, he wrote that, by the way, the whole story with the Temple Mount has always been discussed for many, many years. Why did Moses Montefiore gain access? First of all, he was very influential, but it was sort of the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had certain rules, and at that point they were in control of the access. And when started the Crimean Wars, there was a Treaty of Paris signed in 1856, and they gave more allowances. They agreed the Temple Mount would be open to non-Muslims. You had to get an admission ticket from them. But at that time, basically, if you had an in, you could get access. He records, based on a different source, that Moses Montefiore went in what he calls a box, cabinet, or a tower, which in Chazal is called a Shida Tevu Umigdal. He says here that he went inside a box. They carried Moses Montefiore in a box, and somehow he thought if he was in that box, he was in a different rishus, a different domain, and therefore he avoided the issues of tumah. But either way, the question bears asking, what was this whole debate about? What were the rabbis talking about? What's this Ravid? What are the reasons to go? What are the reasons not to go? It's always been, since the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, we shall see, Jews have always prayed towards that space, and we've always, with the Shulchan Aruch writes that when you daven anywhere in the world, you first think of Eretz Yisrael, you turn yourself towards the Mizrach if you're west of it, and you think of Yerushalayim, and then you turn your focus to the Beis HaMikdash, and then the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So we have to discuss a little bit what would be the problem of going there, what's the purpose, why is there an interest in going there, and hopefully come to some understanding of the current debate. Because as you probably are aware, it's a very strongly debated, heated discussion. There's political considerations, there are hashkafic considerations, and there's also halachic. We're going to try to focus on the halachic, but obviously there's, as with many things, there is overlap in these different areas. But I'm going to focus mostly on the halachic debate. So in the same article, Lowenberg writes that it's been assumed, and the basic position of many, that the Al-Aqsa, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Al-Aqsa is what the Temple Mount is now referred to by Muslims, is it basically does not belong to the Jewish people, it belongs to the Arab nations. And the Temple Mount is exclusively a Muslim holy site. This is what is often assumed by many people, and one of the reasons that they state as a proof that this is not a Jewish site is because Jews don't go there. So there's sort of this, I would say, this gray or there's a confusion. You don't mind closing the door? Thank you. There's a little bit of it's a folk tale. It's it's hard to really. I'm not an expert in other religions, but there's a misunderstanding historically, because the fact that Jews don't go there doesn't mean that we have no claim to it. It's just actually the opposite. Because it's so holy to us, there are certain rules and we'll see there's certain prohibitions that are associated with it. So the fact that we don't go there has nothing to do with our rights to say that eventually it'll be a Jewish site of worship. So, but you could see where the tension comes. Actually, I believe in Islamic religious law, I believe they also are. They don't allow non-Muslims to go into certain parts as well. So they have this similar conception as well. So another point in this whole, debate is there is this, what Lowenberg calls a folk tale, is that the Western Wall was awarded to the Jews as a place of worship in compensation for any rights they used to have for the Temple Mount. So it's like, okay, you used to have this, now you have the Western Wall it's instead. So he quotes here from a number of letters. One is from Rav Avaya of Bartanura, one is from his students, that the reason why we don't go, and it's pretty obvious to those who understand what the Torah says and how halacha works, but Jews did not go because it's forbidden by halacha. Not because we don't have any claim to it. And he says, and there's another reason we don't go, and that's because it's not even under our control anyways. So the point is that for many, many years, or you could say hundreds of years, potentially thousands of years, Jews have been potentially forbidden. We'll have to see what this forbidden, what this would be, what this violation would be, what this prohibition would be, and if it applies today. But we have records of Jews who went up. We saw Moses Montefiore, the Rabbi in this tshuva is mentioned as the Rabbi that we're going to see talks about going up. There are Jews today, which I think we all know. Maybe everyone knows someone who knows someone. But people go on these trips. So are they doing the right thing? Are they doing the wrong thing? And why do we have these records of Jews saying that it's been forbidden for hundreds of years? And that's why we don't go up. It's not because we don't lay claim to the land, but rather because we treat it it's such a holy site for us, that's why we don't go. So what's the Isser? What's this all about? So let's start with the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Pesach Bechira, Perek Zayin Halacha Yud Aleph, he says that in the encampments, not those encampments, the encampments in Bamidbar, the encampments in the Midbar when the Jewish people were traveling in the wilderness, so they had certain ways that they organized their encampments, which interesting, we're not going to really get into, is the differences between the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan, which is interesting to think about because the Mishkan was a portable thing, right? So when we talk about this whole discussion, which is something that I'm interested in and started to research further, maybe for a different time, is the whole idea of Kedushas Makom, the whole idea of the holiness of a place. But the Mishkan moved. So it can't just be the place. And then there's a whole idea of Kedushas Hazman, the time that we make holy. So it's a very interesting topic. How does Judaism look at holiness? Something to maybe for a different slot, a different time, but we're focused on halacha here. But there is a halacha that the Rambam says we learn out from the encampments in the wilderness. There were three basic groups of encampments. There was the Machane Yisrael, the encampment of the Jewish people, Machane Levia, and Machane Shechina. Where were these different camps? So the Machane Yisrael, where the Jewish people encamped. The Machane Levia, he writes, was outside of the Mishkan. And Machane Shechina was Mipesach Chatzar Ohel Moed v'lifnim. The opening of the Ohel Moed, the tent of the gathering, and inward. Then he writes a very important line over here. Ukenegdan ledoros. Based on these three levels is how we correspondingly have the halacha for future generations. Mipesach Yerushalayim ad Har Habayis. From the beginning of Yerushalayim. A lot of the poskim discuss all these different marks. Where do you mark it? Is it the wall? But let's just try to focus on the Har Habayis question. From Pesach Yerushalayim to Ad Har Habayis, that's called Kimachane Yisrael. Jewish people can go there. Mi Pesach Har Habayis Ad Pesach HaZara Shushar Nikanor Kimachane Levia. We'll have to see what these mean, but Machane Levia is a higher level of sanctity, and there are certain people who are excluded from Machane Levia, and that is Shar Nikanor. Now, if you want to take a look, I have some drawings for you. It would be good to have maybe a projector or something, but it's too late for that. But if you take a look, the top is from the Machon HaMikdash, which you find the same diagram in many of the Mishnayos, in the Kahati Mishnayos and Maseches Midos. This is the Bayasheni. What's a little confusing about this is the top is not north. I'm sorry, the top is north, but it's actually not west-east. It's reversed. So therefore I brought another flipped diagram so you could see it a little bit more easily. So if you take a look, you see on the right side is Ezras Nashim, and that's from the outside of the Soreg, which is the outside wall, the Soreg and the Chel. So outside of that wall would be Machane Yisrael, which would be considered Har Habayis. Like we said, right from Yerushalayim to Har Habayis, it's Machane Yisrael. Then inside the Chel, which is the Ezras Nashim, up until Shar Nikanor, which you see those like semicircle steps there. So you could see on the top it flips it around, but basically that's where you enter if you're going from east to west. So that entrance from that gate into the next level would be, which is inside going towards the Azara, towards the Heichal, and then to the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's all. Once you enter into that shar, into that gate, that's called Machane Shechina. The Rambam actually doesn't say. He says, "Mi Pesach ha'azara v'lifnim machane shechina." He doesn't say the kaf hadimyon. He says machane shechina. The other ones he says ki machane Yisrael, ki machane Levia. Then he says machane shechina. So we're going to come back to that hopefully. But he says it's not like it is. It is literally machane shechina. Okay. Now what's clear is that the Temple Mount, as we call it today, is not exactly the same as Har Habayis. So take a look at this. This is a diagram from 1983. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you take a look, we're going to have another one from the Machon HaMikdash, the Temple, Jerusalem Temple Foundation. This is a drawing, but as you can see, there's two basic drawings there of the Mikdash. The bottom left, which is really towards the western corner, is, I believe, the Kotel, the western wall. But as you can see, however they mapped it out, that's going to be the Mikdash, those two boxes in the middle, but this whole square is the Temple Mount, right? So just because you're not allowed to go inside of the temple, inside of the Har Habayis, potentially, we'll see why you would or you wouldn't, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't go into the Temple Mount. So that's really going to be the question. The question is, where are all these places? We mentioned Machane Yisrael outside of Ezras Nashim, outside the Chel and the Soreg, which is like the outer perimeter. That's Machane, up from Yerushalayim all the way up to there. That's Machane Yisrael. Inside the Azara, we said, was Machane Levia. Sorry, the Ezras Nashim. Into the Shar Nikanor, into the Azara, that's Machane Shechina. So what are these levels and who cares? So in Bamidbar, Perek Hey, Pasuk Beis, you can take a look at source number 5. So Hashem says to Moshe, Tzavis b'nei Yisrael, Yishalchu min hamachane. Command the Jewish people to send this person out of the tent, Kol tsarua, anyone who has tsaras, which is why I picked this topic also, because this past week's parsha was Parshas Mitzorah. Anyone who's tsarua has to go outside the machane. V'chol zav, anyone who has it in some sort of emission, this is a male zav. Zava is also, it's not a regular seminal emission, it has to do something with an illness. It's not really clear what it is, but it's some sort of emission. V'chol tamei l'nefesh, anyone who is exposed to a dead body. So it doesn't say which machane you're supposed to be excluded from. So without getting into all the details, the Mitzorah, the one who has tsaras, has to be excluded from the he has a third level basically of exclusion, and this is learned out from the pasuk in Parshas Tazria. Kol yimei asher hanega bo yitamei tamei hu badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshavo. And Rashi says, what does this mean? He has to be alone chutz me'amachane. Chutz l'shalosh ha'machanos. The Mitzorah has to go out of every machane, so he can't even be in Machane Yisrael. He has to be outside of Machane Yisrael. So the Gemara in Pesachim and in other places breaks it down into three different categories, and there's really three different halachos in regards to these different types of tumah, types of ritual impurity. So a good summary of this is in the Mishnah in Kalim, and in the Bar Tanura's commentary on that. So take a look. This is just very, very basic. So we have three camps, and the Mishnah in Kalim says we have the Ezras Yisrael. I'm just skipping a little bit. It's more Kadosh than Yerushalayim. And what does he say? Ein mechusar kippurim nichnas l'sham. Someone who has to bring a carbon and didn't is not allowed to go in there. And if they do, chayavin aleha achatas. They would be chayiv achatas if they went in there. So if you take a look at source number 10, the Bar Tanura says, so first of all, he says that Mishar Nikanor v'lefnim machane shchina, u'mihar Habayis v'lechutz ad chomas Yerushalayim machane Yisrael. Okay. So far we have three levels. We have the Mitzorah has to be outside of Machane Yisrael, which would be basically Yerushalayim. And then we have the two other levels. So who's allowed to be a Machane Levia, Machane Shechina? So let's take a look. So the Rambam actually summarizes, based on this Mishnah in Kalim, he gives us a good summary. He says in Beis Bechira, Perek Zayin, Pasa Halacha Yudalid through Yudches. So if you're talking about how Yerushalayim was Mukudash, how Yerushalayim got its holy sanctified status. And then he goes on to explain Habayis. So he says, who's allowed to go into Habayis? Habayis, Mukudash Mimenu, She'ein Zavin V'Zavos Nidos V'Yodos Nechnasin L'Sham. Habayis, you can't have, we mentioned this, strange emission that we don't really have today, and a woman who's a nida, a woman who gave birth, they can't go onto Habayis. Umutur lahachnis hameis atzmo laHabayis. You're allowed to bring the mace onto Habayis. Ve'ein tzarich lomar t'mei meis shehu nichnas hasham. Of course, someone who is exposed to a mace is allowed to go there. If a mace could go there, then even someone exposed to the mace could go there. But again, that's all outside of Machane Levia. So when he's referring to Habayis, as we said before, that would be outside of the Chel. So we really have Habayis, then we have inside the Chel, which would be in the diagram inside the Ezras Nashim. Inside Shar Nikanor would be Machane Levia. Inside Shar Nikanor would be Machane Shechina. Now look at what he writes about. So we really have three layers. We have to do a little bit of a summary here. Three concentric circles with different rules. In the Azara, we said if you go in there, you're going to be chayiv kares. Did we do Azara? No, we didn't do Azara yet. Look at we didn't get to Azara yet. Sorry. Look at Halach Yurches. Ezras Yisrael Mikudash mi Ezras Nashim She'ein mechusar kippurim nichsin l'sham v'tamei. This is the key line here. a tamei meis shenichnas l'sham chayiv kares. If a tamei meis goes into the azara, then he's going to be chayiv kares. Okay. So let's take a step back. We have the azara. The azara, which we just read, would be a tamei meis would be chayiv kares. This would also include a zav and a zava and a mitzora. A zav and a zava and a mitzora have an even more higher level of tumah. They're not even allowed to be in the machane leviyah. And in Yerushalayim, the mitzora himself had to be excluded. Okay, so that's all when we had the Beis HaMikdash. So basically, what's going to be a problem is, even if you go to the mikvah, if you try to rid yourself of all tumah, of emissions, or all those types of things, the problem is, for tamei meis, as we know, you have to have the waters of the parah aduma to remove that tumah. And the waters of the parah aduma require the ashes of the red heifer, and we don't have the ashes of the red heifer. So we all were born in hospitals and probably are exposed to some level of tumas meis. And therefore, we could assume that most of us are tamei meis. Well, what about the fact is that that's all true when we had a Beis HaMikdash, but now we don't have a Beis HaMikdash anymore. So does that mean that the fact that we have no temple anymore, does that mean that we could then remove, or the tumah is maybe not as significant, or maybe not as much of a prohibition? So this is actually a debate in Masechtas Megillah. It's a debate if Kidsha Rishona, Kidsha L'Asad Lavo, or Lo Kidsha L'Asad Lavo. When there was a Kedusha that was imbued into the Makam HaMikdash, was that because of the fact that the Beis HaMikdash was there, but once it's gone, it is no longer Kadosh? Or do we say that no, it's not a function of the Beis HaMikdash, but rather it's the function of the space? I see that just we're getting a little bit short for time. So let me just tell you what the Rambam says. The Rambam has a sort of a compromise opinion. He has a very fascinating psak here. It's debated in the Gemara, it's debated in the Poskim. The Rambam says that there's a difference between Yerushalayim and Habayis and Mikdash and what's called Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So he says, when it comes to Kedushas, what he calls Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, if you take a look at Beis HaBechira Perek Vav, Halacha Tes Zayin, he says, Lamani Omer Mikdash Yerushalayim Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Asad Lavo. Why do I tell you that the Mikdash in Yerushalayim, the original Kedusha, lasts for perpetuity? Ube Kedusha Shar Eretz Yisrael Inyan Shvias Umaisros Uchiyot Ben Lo Kitchel Asad Lavo. When it comes to Kedusha's Eretz Yisrael, all the mitzvahs Satuliyah Ba'aretz, Shemitah, Shvias, which is Shemitah, Meiser, all those things are not relevant anymore when there's no Beis HaMikdash. So he asks almost the question, how can I distinguish? He says there's two dinim. There's two basic principles of Kedusha. One is still here and one is not here without the temple. One is the Kedusha HaMikdash, and then the other is Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Lefish Kedushas HaMikdash Yerushalayim, he puts them together, Yerushalayim and Kedushas HaMikdash. B'pnei HaShchina. Remember I told you, he said Machane Shchina, he said it connected on the Doros, and the encampments in the Midbar all corresponded to different things, but then he just says, what was the inner one? It was Machane Shchina. It was not Ki Machane Shchina, it's Machane Shchina, because Shchina can't change. He says Shchina Eina Betela. The Shechina can't be lost. Whatever this means, the Shechina's presence is never lost. It's never gone. And therefore, Kedushas HaMikdash, even when we don't have a temple, is never lost. So the Rambam says when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, this has ramifications for Hilchah Shemitah and Meiser and all these things. The Kedusha is lost. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash. But you can't say, according to the Rambam, you can't say that the Kedusha of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim are gone because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam says because Shechina Eina Betela, the presence of Hashem never leaves, and therefore it's not dependent on the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. Yeah.
By that logic, couldn't you just go to Shechem or where the Mishkan was?
So it's the whole discussion. How do we understand Mishkan Shiloh and all these other places that had a Mishkan? And it goes back to the original comment I made about the differences between Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash. It's a bigger discussion. It's a good question, though. That's the Rambam's opinion. Remember I mentioned the Ravid, that the Montefiore said, I went with my rabbi and we were following the Ravid. So here's the Ravid. The Ravid says, he's not so happy with this Rambam. He says, "What are you talking about? You're making this distinction, yes, and for Mikdash, but no for Eretz Yisrael. It's not any. What he says." Source number 14, Svaras Atzmohi. This is his own opinion. V'lo yadati mi'ayin lo. I don't know where he got this from. He says, no, what are you talking about? He says, it's the Kedusha is no longer, at this point, Kitsha la'asid lavo. And he says, Yushalayim le'mikdash, he says, Shahayodea Ezra, Shahamikdash v'Yushalayim asidin lehishtanos ulehiskadish kiddush achar olami b'kavod Hashem la'olam. He says, in the future times, Ezra knew this, and it was known that the third base Hamikdash will be permanent, and there will be a new kedusha that is imbued into that place by the third base Hamikdash. Now look at this line. This is incredible. He says, Kach niglali misod Hashem li'irav. This is what was revealed to me by the secrets of God. What does it mean? He's saying with Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, I don't know what it means. But then look at this. Here we go. Lefikach hanichnis atah. If you go in there now, he's talking about going into Habayis, going into the Azara, all these places, ein bo kares. There's no kares. The Rambam said if you go into the Azara to being a Tamei Meis, which we know today we're all Tamei Meis basically, the Rambam said chayiv kares. That's based on his understanding of Kitchul Asid Lavo. It has a sanctity even without the Beis Hamikdash. The Rabbi says, what are you talking about? It was revealed to me. I have this, usually not the way we paskin halacha, but it was revealed to me that no, it's gone, and in the future times the kedusha will come back. But ein bo kares. This is the key line. There's no kares. Kares is some sort of spiritual punishment. So there's a debate in the poskim. Even if we're going to go with the Ravid, when the Ravid says there's no kares, does that mean that it's allowed, or does it mean it's not allowed, but it's not kares? So that's a debate. And even so, the poskim really seem to go like the Rambam. Ravadia, you could see on your source sheet in 15, 16, 17, Magen Avraham, Mishnah Brura, all seem to assume, like the Rambam, that today there would still be a prohibition of kares to go into the Azara, into Machane Levia for a Tamei Meis. The Machane Levia would be into the Ezras Nashim, but to go into the Azara would be going even further, being Machane Shechina, and that would be considered a problem of an Isser Kares.
So the problem today is that people are Tamei Meis, and therefore you can't. If the holiness stays, then you're going Tamei Meis into play. So and we can't get rid of
Habayis
because we don't have the Paradum or whatever.
Yeah.
So why do people? What's the point of going to the mikvah before if you're not?
You have to get rid of Tumas, Kari, Zav, all these other things.
You don't get rid of all of it, but you're
getting rid of certain things. You're getting rid of, but you can't get rid of the Tumas Mace. If you had Taras, you don't have a Kohen saying that it's Taras. Hopefully anyone has Taras, but we don't really see it today anymore. But you have to get rid of all kinds of forms of Tameh, of Tumah. Now, again, like I mentioned before, we don't really know exactly where these areas are. But again, the most you could be chayiv for, as we mentioned, if you're Tamei Meis, would be going into the Azara. But most of the modern day poskim say we follow the Rambam, and therefore you can't just say, well, the Ravid said Ein Bo Kares, I'm not going to consider the Rambam. It seems to be the consensus goes according to the Rambam. But there's another question which we have to address, and that is, well, okay, we just said you can't go into the Machane Shechina if you're Tamei Meis. Well, we said you could go onto Habayis. You just can't go into the Machane Shechina. So the question would be, if you can't go into Machane Shechina, why can't we just map out the Habayis, figure out where it is, and make sure that you're outside of that area? Make sure you're in what's called Machane Levia, and for sure Machane Yisrael will be okay. Right? So you're walking into the old city, You're going around. You see. You're going down that street. What's that? They have like a. It's like a not. I forgot what its name is. It's been too long. But you're going down past Shar Yafo, and then you go into this street. Make a left, past this little makola. What's that street called? I don't remember. It has a name. Either way, so you're going in. So you're in Yerushalayim. You're inside the old city. You're allowed to be there if you're Tamei Meis. No one says you can't be there. The problem would be not Machane Yisrael, but Machane Shechina, Machane Levia. We said before it would if you were being the Machane Levia, a zav and a zava or a nida and yoledes would be a problem, but not a Tamei Meis. So can we map it out? Can we know where exactly we're supposed to go and not supposed to go? So the Mishnah in Midos says, Habayis, haya chamesh meos amma, al chamesh meos amma. It's 500 amos by 500 amos. Okay, great. So map out the 500 by 500, and for sure the rest of it you could go on to, no problem. Which brings us to the Radvaz. I mentioned the Radvaz before. The Radvaz has asked in a tshuva, about this question, source number 19. This is in Tshuva Tov Reish Tzadi Aleph. And he says that we see people going up to Habayis and nobody's protesting. So maybe you could go. So he says, he makes this cheshbon, he makes this calculation that he says, Hadavar Barur, she Tachas HaKippah, underneath the mosque, underneath the cover is Evan Hashasiya, Beli Suffolk. He knows for sure. Underneath is the Evan Hashasiya, Hanikra Etzlam Alaktsara. Alakta. Not Alexa, but that's where it is. And therefore he maps it out based on that, 500 by 500. Now, other posts, so based on this Radbaz, some say, well, he makes a certain assumption that the place you start mapping it out is where the Dome of the Rock, where that cover is, and that's where the Evan Hashasiya is, that's where the Kodesh HaKadosh, and that's where the Aron was. If you take a look at Mechon HaMikdash, there's two, I should have printed it in color because it's color coded. Two diagrams here, but you could see what the it's almost like they took a copy and paste of the diagram we were using before in the bottom one by the Mishnah and Midos, and they put it on top of it. As you could see, the bottom right there is the western wall. The bottom right, by number 1, is the western wall. That's where the Kotel is. It's the Kotel Plaza. And so they're arguing, look, the Mikdash is basically the inside box by number 3, and outside of number, those arrows are all like basically the Temple Mount. And you could go outside of that area. That's what they're arguing based on other sources, but I think they're basing it also on the Radbaz. The problem is, do we really accept this Radbaz? We don't know where to start the calculation of the 500 by 500 because we don't know exactly where Habayis is. So that's Rav David Friedman, and he's known as Rav David Karliner. He is quoted by Moshe Feinstein and others, and source number 21, and he says, I don't really know. I'm not sure if we could rely on this. There's a different different non-halakhic sources that say, well, there's the Evan Hashasiya, and that's really the place where the Aron was. He says, I don't know if you could really rely on that and this tradition or this assumption that the Radbaz makes that that's where you start counting. He says, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Can we rely on this on different agadatas and different non-halakhic works to paskin a halacha? And it's one thing if you go with the Rambam. The Ravid, that there's no kares, but we're dealing with the Rambam, so you're playing with fire. And number 3, he says, how much of the amos are also debated, how much is an amma, so he's very unsure if we can rely on this. And this is what basically, I don't have time to go into all of it, but Rav Moshe quotes this. He says some people were even nervous about going to the Kotel, the Brisker Rav, because maybe the Kotel, we think that the Kotel is outside of the Mikdash, but maybe it's not, we don't know. So Rav Moshe says, that's crazy. We have this long-standing tradition. People go to the Kotel, and therefore we know that it's not a problem. So he doesn't think that makes any sense. But we see that there were poskim that were very nervous about relying on the Radbaz's calculation. And that's what Rav Avadia basically says after 1967, when there was even more access. he says, he writes an incredible, miraculous, reunification of Yerushalayim and all these miracles. But at the end of the day, he says this Rabbis people want to use, but we're not sure. We're not sure about this Rabbis. Many were question this Rabbis, and as I mentioned to you, everyone assumes like the Rambam, and therefore it's an Isser Kares, and therefore it's very unclear if we can rely on the calculation. So at the end of the day, many of the poskim question basically how do you make the 500 by 500. Everyone agrees. You could go on to, in theory, Habayis. You could even, in Tamei Meis, if you could get rid of the other Tumos, you could even go into Machane Leviyah like we saw. But we don't know where to calculate it. And therefore, many poskim say, why would you do something which is risking some Isser Kares? Others want to argue, I think this is politically motivated, others want to argue that, like I mentioned in the beginning of this year, that some want to claim that there's no Jewish claim to the Habayis, and therefore we need to show them there really is a Jewish claim, and therefore we need Jewish presence at in Habayis. The counter to that is if we're getting into the political realm, you could be pouring fuel into the fire. You could be adding fuel to the fire of all of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You're just saying you're going to entice people who are ready to attack, and you're going to add to the animosity, and not going to raise tensions. Just to give you some historical, we'll finish with this, some historical precedent of this debate. In the 1920s, so Rav Kook was involved in this called this whole Kotel. It was really, there was not so much access to the Temple Mount, but sort of the Kotel affair, which is known as the Kotel affair, and it was always a place of contention. And at some point in 1922, on 1928, on Yom Kippur of 1928. This is from Yehuda Mirsky's biography on Rav Kook, a fantastic book. He writes that British constables forcibly removed a makeshift mechitza at the Western Wall, and Rav Kook called for a public fast, and basically it was a whole, they allowed the Jews to pray there, but they didn't allow benches there, and it was a whole back and forth. There was a British white paper in November of 1928 that tried to retain the status quo of the Kotel and said, don't make any changes. Now we have a whole plaza there, but back then it was considered a violation of the laws or the status quo, and they saw that because they put benches and a mechitza, maybe they're going to go and take over the Temple Mount, and then tensions mounted, and this was part of the precursor to the whole 1929 riots, and there were Jews killed, there were Arabs killed, and there's just, I'll just quote for you one piece of this whole terrible chapter of our history. Rav Kook writes open letter to the Mufti, and he says that I know that your ways are that the Arab nation as a whole and the majority of the Arabs in the land of Israel are embarrassed by the fact that these people are attacking Jews. He had high hopes for the peaceful sort of conclusion here, but he says that the fact that you're spreading these lies about us, that we're trying to take over the Temple Mount and is incorrect, and basically in the 20s and from then on, there's always been this connection between the overall conflict and people's interest or I guess the contentions of the Kotel, and within that the Temple Mount. So basically, in short, it seems like you understand why there's a debate. You understand why people who are Tamei Meis would be concerned about going up to the Temple Mount. You can understand why people don't want to add fuel to the fire, but you could also understand why some say that we need to show that there is a Jewish connection to the Temple Mount, and the fact that there are tensions is going to always be tensions. But we don't have to worry about that. But yeah, it's an ongoing debate, and there are different sides to it. I know I've seen videos where Moshe David Tendler, the son-in-law of Moshe Feinstein, he went up on the Temple Mount. I believe the Rabbanut Harashi, their opinion is that you should not go onto the Temple Mount. Some say, that's politically motivated because they don't want to cause problems. It's all interconnected. But I think the consensus of the mainstream poskim is that we don't know exactly how to measure it. In theory, like Ramosha says, we could go up there, in theory, even to Memes, but we don't exactly know where it is, and therefore, better to err on the side of caution. That's what I think
So
that...
the Temple Mount website, I think, or whatever, has a map of like where you're going.
Yeah, it's on the source sheet, this map. It's just...
Oh, so that one tells you.
This shows you where they're measuring. I believe they're basing it on a few different sources. One of them is the Radbaz, because they're starting their beginning of their measurement from the Even HaShasiyah, which is that under the dome of the rock. They're assuming that. So the Radbaz says it's for sure, no suffix in my mind. Can you base halacha on this?
So the dome
That's the question.
The Dome of the Rock is part of the Temple Mount?
The dome of the rock, they claim, is underneath the dome of the rock,
Yes.
is what's called the Even HaShasiyah, which is where the space, according to our tradition, it's not a halachic source, it's an agadic source, is where the Kodesh HaKadoshim would be, and everything moves out from there. So you have to measure 500 by 500. Let's say you're machmir for the biggest share of your amma, and you're going to be super machmir, but that still is going to leave you with a lot of space to
500
go.
by 500 what?
Amos.
So what's that? in feet?
Let's say it's 2.5 feet per amma, or let's even go 3. You know, it's you have a lot, but the whole area is much more than that, right?